welcome to The Scoop, our weekly Henry Jackson Society discussion on the threats facing the Western world, being broadcast to you live from Millbank Tower in the heart of Westminster. While others are keen to play down the threats facing our democracy, values and societies, here we promise to give you the truth straight and unvarnished. Just as importantly, we pledge to involve you, our audience, too. This show is not about us talking and you listening. Instead, if you've got something to say, you can click the link in the video description just under where you are watching. You'll be redirected to our online studio and might get to ask one live. I can't promise we'll agree with you if you're called, but I can tell you we'll certainly engage with your point of view. Today, we are looking at the ways in which authoritarian states try to secure their objectives. One obvious path is war, as shown by Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. Another is terrorism, as exemplified by countries like Iran. But others like China pursue a subtler path, using carrots like economic aid and sticks like trade boycotts in a bid to advance their interests. I'll be asking what the free world needs to be aware of in dealing with such threats, and crucially, how we can stop them. Joining me at HGS Towers to discuss this subject is Hong Kong Watch founder Ben Rogers, who recently felt the long arm of Chinese justice when he found himself pursued by Hong Kong police in London for the crime of defending liberty, and Emily Carver making a welcome return to HGS as the Institute of Economic Affairs head of media. And don't forget, we want to hear from you during the show with your thoughts. To ask your question live, please click through on the link in the description or visit henryjacksonsociety.org/the scoop, and we will do our best to bring you into the discussion. Ben, Emily, thank you for joining me. It's obviously a very topical discussion for three reasons, actually. Russian war in Ukraine, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's release in Iran, a hostage-taking situation, and of course, Ben, we'll start with you, with your remarkable and quite ridiculous situation. Do you want to just explain to everyone at home what exactly is going on and what happened to you last week?
Yeah, absolutely. So about a month ago, Hong Kong Watch's website was blocked in Hong Kong, and we confirmed that with a number of sources. I think, perfectly legitimately asked the Hong Kong government what the explanation for blocking our website was. And last Thursday or last week, I got the explanation, which was a letter from the Hong Kong police, followed by an email from the Hong Kong National Security Bureau, basically telling us that our website poses a serious national security threat to China, that we must take it down within 72 hours of receipt of the letters, and failure to comply would result in me personally, as the founder and chief executive, facing potentially a very heavy fine and a prison sentence of anything between 3 years and life in prison in Hong Kong.
Absolutely extraordinary. Yes. So let's just get this straight. Hong Kong Watch, obviously an organization looking at the breakdown of liberty, I suppose, in Hong Kong since China has decided to churn the screws, is now deemed a national security threat to China. And you are under threat of being imprisoned or fined, presumably should you step foot back in their jurisdiction.
That's correct. Although just to add to that, in 2017, I was denied entry to Hong Kong and therefore effectively banned. So it's an odd situation where I can't go back anyway, but if I do, I would face a prison sentence.
I mean, one obviously thing we've seen in the past is that Interpol red notices can be sent out on something like that. Is this a situation you're worried about, that actually, in theory, you could now potentially be arraigned anywhere around the world if the Hong Kong police decide to put one of these ridiculous warrants out for you?
That is definitely a concern, particularly with countries that have extradition agreements, either with Hong Kong or with China itself. And of course, no one knows this subject better than Bill Browder, and I have been in touch with him and he's given me some advice. So it's something I'm aware of.
Emily, this is a crazy situation, obviously. What do you make of this, though, from the perspective of foreign, frankly, dodgy laws coming into play into the UK and a perfectly normative process, i.e., trying to hold a government to account, is being threatened by jail and a fine? What should our response be to this?
Well, I was in Hong Kong at the start of the pro-democracy protests. I was there after I'd graduated. I was there for about 8 months because I have some family over there who have now moved to the UK because of the clampdowns on free speech, because of the clampdowns on protests, because life wasn't so good there anymore to live. So they've decided to move to the UK. Many of my friends have done the same too. I know that over 100,000 people have now fled from Hong Kong. What can we do? Well, my concern in terms of economics is that we are reliant on China in very strategic sectors of ours. We know that in terms of rare earth metals, China is now producing nearly 90%, or at least processing nearly 90% of those materials. What are those materials necessary for? Well, they're necessary for technology. They're necessary for military weapons. They're necessary for electric vehicles. They're necessary for all sorts of strategic areas of our economy that we are now reliant on China for. And I'm concerned about China's influence in not only our economic supply chains that I believe we need to wean ourselves off from, but also in our international organizations. So the World Health Organization, the way they've censored looking into the origins of the coronavirus, the way they censor certain medical research, journalism, and so on. And you can argue that we need to engage with civil society, with those who are willing to speak up against the regime in order to bring them across to our liberal democratic values. But I do think that we need to stand strong against what's happening in Hong Kong. We have a duty to, a historical duty to. And if that means getting tougher, then so be it. If that means that we need to, reduce our reliance on certain areas in those strategic areas, then that is important too.
Makes sense economically to do that. Ben, these are obviously good ideas in the sense of we obviously need to surely wean ourselves away from dependence on China in these things. So maybe you want to give a thought as to whether the possibilities on that. But secondly, also, given Hong Kong Watch's specific look at Hong Kong, is Hong Kong lost essentially now? And are these just the latest tactics to ensure that it will stay lost?
Yeah, so on Emily's point, 100% agree. And I think that we should be diversifying our supply chains. Many of us have been saying this. I know you've been saying this since the start of the pandemic, if not before. And so we should be doing that. We should be looking at other markets. We should also, I think, be looking at targeted sanctions, not against China as a whole or the Chinese people, but against key companies that are complicit with either genocide in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs or the dismantling of Hong Kong's freedoms, or indeed other abuses in China. On your second question, I would say that for the time being, certainly Hong Kong's freedoms have been pretty much totally dismantled. Its autonomy has gone. It's now a city run directly by the Chinese Communist Party. One country, two systems has gone. I'm always cautious about, I don't want to give up. And history shows that dictators don't last forever. So Hong Kong is not necessarily in this situation forever, but certainly for the time being and for as long as the regime in Beijing is there, Hong Kong's freedoms are lost.
Yes, and I think this unfortunately looks to be the case. Now, obviously, China's not going to stop at Hong Kong. It has, eyes on other targets. And one of those targets is Taiwan, of course. We know we've been very conscious, even in the Ukraine crisis, about perhaps the lessons the Chinese might draw from the war in Ukraine for Taiwan. But Emily, you're welcome to address the Taiwan issue in thoughts about how we can look at that aspect from a defence perspective. But also, China has, of course, been trying, has it not, to extend its influence through the Belt and Road Initiative for some time, essentially trying to buy off countries by promising cheap credit. Now, it turns out, of course, latterly, the cheap credit comes with lots of strings attached. But from an economic perspective, how can, again, the free world stand up to this sort of attempt by China to extend its influence?
Yes, I think it's something that perhaps we've been very naive about in the West for a long time, just as we've been very naive about the fact that we're so dependent on Russia for oil and gas. We've let our energy strategy completely become reliant on essentially despotic regimes that we knew them to be so. But instead of investing in our own security supply and instead, signing ourselves up to net zero targets that are to a large extent unachievable and have damaged our security, that we end up in such a position where we're having to go cap in hand to despotic regimes. I think in terms of the way that China is able to use its economic might with smaller countries and ensure its influence in international organizations in that way, many, many countries are indebted to China in such a way that they will have to stand by China, despite its clear human rights abuses, despite its well, it's in many ways imperialist objectives. So what we do in order to combat that, what can we do as the West? I mean, it's unlikely that we will sanction the Chinese regime in any meaningful manner, simply because of the cost to Western economies that would inflict upon ordinary citizens over here. But what we must do is, as I said before, is to diversify our supply chains and ensure that we are not reliant on these regimes to such an enormous extent.
Okay, we can diversify. That's clear. I think all of us agree on that point. Is there a way that we can counter China's investment efforts in a different way? Number one, Ben. And number two, are there lessons from the fall of Hong Kong, if we like, to apply to Taiwan?
Well, if I take the second question first, definitely there are real lessons. Hong Kong is sort of the canary in the coal mine. And if we don't respond to what they've done to Hong Kong with meaningful consequences, targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions against officials in Beijing and in the Hong Kong government, if China's allowed to get away with what it's done with no cost, then it will just be emboldened to increase its aggression towards Taiwan. And the combination of what it's done to Hong Kong and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, although hopefully our response to that may have given Beijing pause for thought, but nevertheless, we have to watch the Taiwan situation extremely carefully and avoid being caught by surprise as we were in Ukraine. We should be be prepared for that eventuality. In terms of countering China's investment, yes, I mean, I think as well as reducing our dependency on China in certain sectors, we also need to be looking at, for example, our university sector in this country, China's extensive influence through funding and through Chinese students. I would never want to say we shouldn't take Chinese students, but we should do more to protect our academic freedom here from China's influence.
To look at that as well.
Yeah, I would just say on the point of sanctions, I've been rather concerned with the way in which it seemed like the government and large parts of the media have seemed to make Russians synonymous with the Kremlin. And I do worry that in terms of sanctioning despotic regimes and those who are close to those regimes in this country, that we end up overruling our own rule of law, overriding our own rule of law, and we become despotic in a similar way. I also don't agree with you that
we have overridden our...
No, but there is a risk that we may, if we follow the populist sentiment to essentially seize property from those with Russian-sounding names. There has to be due process, I believe.
The government's not doing that, are they? The government isn't going every while the Russian name is being targeted. They've got specific lists of people who are being put down who are connected to the
I don't
regime.
believe Michael Gove was particularly careful with his words when he talked about seizing properties for Ukrainian refugees to live in, and it's perhaps gave a sort of carte blanche for those who then decided to sit on top of a property in South Kensington, I believe it was.
You were going to say you didn't agree with something else, though.
Oh, the other thing that I don't agree was, or that I'm not sure on, is whether we should be banning Russia Today in this country. I'm not sure that you combat despotic regimes by bringing in censorship over here, however distasteful their output might be.
Ben, what's your view on that, actually? Because, of course, the PR drive is important here. The Chinese, as well, have been engaged in PR. Iran's got its own PR operation in Press TV. What do you think? I mean, should they be allowed carte blanche to publish, or rather to broadcast, or should there be some restrictions? By the way, I should point out to both of you, I'm delighted they're no longer here because they were in this very building, 4 floors down. So, yes, very happy not to see them every day anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, I have some mixed feelings because I don't like censorship generally, but I think we should take into account, firstly, there's a war situation in Ukraine, and although we're not an active participant in the war, in war certain things change, and propaganda is something that needs to be countered. So I think for that reason, I think I do support the ban on Russia Today. And if you take, for example, Chinese state television, an approach that I think has proven quite successful has been the filing of complaints with Ofcom by a number of individuals, Peter Humphrey, Angela Gui, Simon Chung, all people who have been victims of the Chinese Communist Party regime. they filed complaints because CGTN, the Chinese overseas state broadcaster, was broadcasting forced televised confessions of prisoners, including some of the individuals who filed the complaints. And I think, and Ofcom upheld their complaints and said CGTN was in violation of our broadcasting standards and is now banned here. And I think those are absolutely right ways to approach this.
Okay, noted. Now, we're going to switch track to the Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe story for a second, and then we're going to come to everyone's views at home, and we're going to see some questions from there. But Emily, everyone, I mean, and Ben, everyone is delighted, of course, that she's free. No, there's not a person who isn't delighted that someone who was unjustly imprisoned for 6 years is free, but of course she said some pretty controversial things yesterday. Now, I'm of the opinion, you serve 6 years, in the Iranian prison, you can come out and say what you like at the end of the day from that perspective. But if we take a step back for a second, is she right to heap opprobrium on British foreign secretaries for failing to get her out? Is this missing the point somewhat?
I would have preferred to have heard her speak of the Iranian regime in the same way that she spoke of the British government. It did seem that her words were perhaps poorly phrased. But again, when you're, locked up for 6 years, I can imagine that you may be very angry, as it appeared to her probably that it was very easy for her to be released. All it took was the UK government handing over 400 million dollars to the Iranian regime for an historic debt. So I guess from her perspective, I can understand why she'd be furious that this hadn't occurred sooner. However, I do have concerns about the fact that we've handed over this money. I do worry that there is absolutely no way of ensuring that the Iranian regime spends this on humanitarian areas of spending. And even if they do, what are they going to do with the 400 million they've therefore saved by way of receiving this money? I am concerned that, again, we may be being totally naive. But then, of course, there's the realpolitik. We need Iranian oil back on the system. We need the supplies. If we're going to be sanctioning Russia to a high degree, if Europe is going to become less dependent on Russia, are we going to need to seek oil from Iran and other regimes that we don't particularly want to do business with? I mean, it all has to come with a sort of sense of, reality, isn't it?
Yes, I suppose so, in that sense. And Ben, this is a bit of a concern, though, isn't it? I mean, forget for the moment what you said, but the very fact we've done a deal with Iran in this respect, surely this is the wrong sort of message to be sending. I mean, they've been taking hostages for years. They get, sort of benefit from it. How does this help our long-term cause beyond, obviously, rescuing innocents who are caught up in their trap?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging question because, as you say, we're all delighted that she has finally been freed, and she should never have been taken in the first place, of course, and never have served so long. And in terms of what she said, she has every right to say how she feels. I think that we should remember that this payment, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert on that part of the world, but from what I understand, it was a payment of a debt rather than a payment of a ransom. And there is a difference. I think we should...
I hear you, but we all know what it really was about.
It felt like a ransom.
Yeah.
Whatever you want to say about it. A debt to a sanctions regime where you have to go through all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, true. And I mean, I certainly agree with Emily that, it leaves a horrible taste in terms of we can't monitor how that money is used. So sometimes in life you are faced between two horrible choices, and getting Nazanin out was the right thing to do, but yeah, it's come at a horrible cost.
It has. Right. You've coped with my grilling quite well. We're going to turn to see what grilling we will receive from you at home, and we're going to start with Jonathan Lux. Jonathan, are you there? No, apparently not. Jonathan's not there. We're going to go to Camille instead. Camille, are you there? Whoever Camille is, Camille, come forth. No, we can't hear Camille. Not there? Okay. Dr. Schultz. Is there a problem with the system, one has to wonder at this point in time? Okay, we'll try James Chalk.
Hello.
There's
Hello.
Thank you for the talk. Yes, go on, James.
I'm just wondering how it's possible to Wayne Assad weigh ourselves off of Chinese rare earth elements when they control in their territory 80% of the deposits?
Okay, thank you very much, James. A reminder to everyone else, if you were in the Studio Link system, you've got to stay there basically to ask your question. But right, rare earths. Emily, where do we go for this? I mean, if much of the world's rare earth components are in China, what do we do about that to actually ensure that we get access?
Well, I mean, that's a very difficult question. I believe the US is now very much trying to play catch up. I mean, they've made it clear that they are attempting to, diversify away from China and mine for these elements themselves. So we'll see how that progresses. But there are no easy answers for this. And it is rather terrifying somewhat that we are so dependent on one country for these extremely necessary products. I mean, solar panels, for example, the components of solar panels are 60 to 80% derived from China. Yeah. So moving to net zero isn't going to stop us from being dependent on China in that way. So I think this has to be a concerted effort. It's going to take long-term thinking from our governments, which they're not so good at doing, for us to be able to do so.
Any thoughts on this? Any, how do we get over, basically? How do we get over this sort of hump in the sense that we've seen on energy fronts, a lot of the world's energy happens to be with very, unfortunate regimes. Now we're trying to develop our renewables. We're looking at our own sources for that. But is there a magic bullet here, or is it something that takes time?
I think I would say it's something that has to take time. I mean, this isn't an area of my expertise, but I think it is. From what I know, there's no magic bullet. But what I think is important is that we work really closely with our allies, with others in the free world, and that we do this together, because it's a challenge that faces us all, and much better to collaborate on it.
Yes, I think you're right. The idea of a coalition alliance here is clearly the way we're going to overcome this, given the way it still works. Okay, so let's look at Suzanne Rato. Suzanne, are you there? And if you're there, do you want to turn on your mic and your camera? If you are there. No, not there. Okay, I think we've got a problem with the system today on the other end. So we're going to stop for a moment unless there are some calls on there. Let's go back to some other points. I've got plenty, thankfully, to keep us going on the score. If we look collectively now at, if you like, the free world and the unfree world, this is not a great time, is it, in terms of the free world? It's not like the 1980s when we had a feeling we were winning. The 1990s when we sort of felt we'd won, I think, sort of ironically. We're in a period now when the bad guys appear to be making the running. Ben, what's your sense of this? You've obviously been involved in the freedom struggle for some time, not simply in Hong Kong, but in broader areas. Where do we go as a collective on this? And is, for example, Ukraine the real wake-up call that we've needed?
I think this is a defining moment. I think we are now in an existential struggle between freedom and autocracy. On the positive side, I think that on the day of the invasion of Ukraine, I was asked by the Daily Telegraph to write something on Taiwan in light of Ukraine, and I began that article by saying Xi Jinping will be watching the West's response very closely. That was before the West's response came about. And I actually think I'm quite heartened by Germany's extraordinary 180-degree shift and the free world kind of coming together, countries like Switzerland, which are normally neutral, Singapore, others joining in. So there's much more to do. There's no room for complacency, but I think perhaps we are now waking up to the struggle between democracy and autocracy.
Good. Emily, what's your...
Yeah, I would say when it comes to what's happening in Ukraine, it certainly shone a light on our complacency, perhaps, or naivety, that word I've used many times today, because it's very difficult for countries like our own to project power when we're seen to not put the money behind it. And you talk about Germany having, done this 180, but I believe the foreign minister only a couple of days ago, or perhaps today even, said they've run out of weapons. They don't have the necessary weapons. They're too old, etc., etc., etc. hardly projects power on the international stage. But if this is a wake-up call, and I think it needs to be, this is war on European soil. We may not be getting involved in terms of troops on the ground at this stage, but in every way we are involved. In many ways we already are in, what could be said is a World War III, aside from that military support on the ground level. So hopefully this will be that wake-up call that we need to spend more on defence, spend more on our capabilities, hopefully just to act as a deterrent. But I think people who have been very softly on this have completely changed their tune. So that's quite interesting to see.
Well, it's interesting point. Deterrence obviously is the best form because, of course, then you're not getting involved in conflict. I suppose, in a sense, Emily said, it's World War III by another name. Actually, it's more like the Cold War again, isn't it? I mean, this is the sort of thing that we regularly, routinely saw in the Cold War. Country X does this, we're supporting the other side in that way. Now, I'm not sure that's the way it should be, but that is certainly an analogy that works right now. I think the other sort of thing to look at, Ben, is really, if we look at what we should do as a coalition, I think one thing that's been lacking, perhaps, is a sense of US leadership in the way that we used to have this. What's your sense of what is going on with the US here? We don't appear to have the free world having a leader right now.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think the last several US presidents and particularly the current president have really, been so different from the days of Reagan or indeed other presidents one could name. And it's a real worry. I have to say, I really applaud the way Boris Johnson has stepped up to the plate, somewhat to my surprise, I have to admit, over Ukraine. And I hope that, given the absence of US leadership, other forms of leadership in the free world will emerge alongside the Prime Minister. And of course, top of the list, amazingly in his extraordinary, tragic, appalling situation, is the inspiring president of Ukraine, President Zelensky, who, I would say he's the leader of the free world now.
But it is amazing.
Although he's getting brought into the old censorship, is he not, currently?
In terms of?
State-owned media and so on in that country. I don't know. I guess this happens in most countries. But I would say on Western leadership, I think, sadly, the electorates in a lot of Western countries have chosen virtue signaling over substance, be that in the USA, where I can't quite believe President Biden is the leader of the free world. Was it not him who said at the start of all this, before Russia invaded Ukraine, that a small incursion would be essentially okay, or something to that effect? He certainly didn't play up what the American response would be. Throughout this, he seems to have told the world, told the Kremlin exactly what we won't be doing as the Western world, exactly that we won't be putting boots on the ground. I'm not sure how helpful that is. And I think, when it comes to the likes of Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern, many other countries broadly in the West, I think we need to start to realize that we need to project power in this world. Otherwise, other regimes around the world are going to take that power, or they're going to take what we do as weakness, a sign of weakness. So,
thank you, Emily. Ben, a parting thought on that score. What should the message be from the leaders of the West at this moment in time to all those seeking to challenge by the various means we discussed? What is the message?
I think the message should be unequivocally freedom is our fundamental value. We believe passionately in it, and we are prepared to defend it. And we must match that message, as Emily said earlier, with the actual power, with spending on defence. And we should avoid in the future these kind of really unhelpful messages from President Biden about what we're not going to do. Our message should be, touch freedom, and this is what we will do.
Thank you. Ben, thanks for your thoughts. Emily, thanks for your thoughts as well. You at home, thanks for joining us. I'm sorry the system wasn't working brilliantly. We will iron out the kinks for next week's episode. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you for joining us on The Scoop. We'll see you again next week.